This is Daniel Steinberg, and you're listening to The Maggid Method, a new podcast about drushos. Today we're joined by Rabbi Zev Eleff, rabbi, president at Gratz College, author, and academic. Enjoy. And when I went back to look for maybe articles and essays and things about drushos, your article that you wrote for the Jewish Action came up a long time ago. Which was, unbeknownst to me, it was a decade ago. But I thought it might be enjoyable, at least for me, I hope you'll get something out of it, to revisit that article as kind of like a time capsule and see where we are today. It was the cover story. It was fall 2013.
So I found it in hindsight, going backwards, and so I didn't have a chance to see it when it came out, and I wanted to understand what inspired you to write it. What was your connection to the subject?
Good question. So that article that appeared in Jewish Action in fall 2013, The Decline of the Rabbinic Sermon, as I recall it, was motivated by the personal and the professional. Personally, I had just given up on an early career in the rabbinate. I was the William Fishman rabbinic intern at the Jewish Center a few years prior. I say give up. I was really, I think, born to be an academic, to be a writer and a scholar. So it's tongue in cheek.
Mm-hmm. How long were you the rabbi there?
I was the rabbinic intern, just 1 year.
And that was enough.
I was mentored by Rabbi Yossi Levine, who was the senior rabbi there. It was a really wonderful experience. So wonderful, it convinced me that I ought to be a scholar and an historian. So, but in that experience, I had come in contact more deeply with Rabbi Norman Lamb, who of course was for many years the rabbi at the Jewish Center, the president of Yeshiva University. He passed away sadly during the COVID-19 pandemic. I had known him, but this was a different relationship. Where I was not his rabbi by any stretch, but he had attended a number of my shiurim, my lectures at the Jewish Center, and just around that time, his sermons were published online, and first through Yeshiva University, and then through a foundation, an effort from the family, the Lamb Heritage, and.
Is that the Ledoux wrote? Is that the...
Well, so Stu Halpern, a dear friend of mine, he edited those volumes, and they were derived from those collection of sermons, but the online is a much larger reservoir of Rabbi Lamb's sermonic wisdom. Mm-hmm. One of the marquee items in that collection was a lecture he gave, Notes of a non-repentant, I believe, darshan. And Rabbi Lamb explaining how the fall of the style of the sermon, he wrote that in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. You combine that with, so you had on the one hand, personally, I had interacted with Rabbi Lamb. This archive had just been digitized, along with Rabbi Lamb's musings on the state of the Rabbinic Sermon, particularly in the Orthodox world in the 1980s. And professionally, I was at Brandeis as a doctoral candidate studying with Dr. Jonathan Sarna. And there had been a spate of articles, growing literature on the history of the Rabbinic Sermon. Blondheim had written an article on Rabbi Jacob Joseph, Yaakov Yosef, Kimi Kaplan, a great historian, both in Israel, had likewise published on Rabbi Jacob Joseph, the so-called chief rabbi of New York, and how his sermon delivered on the Lower East Side, Abe Kahan, for instance, who was the longtime editor of the Forvert, the Yiddish Daily Forvert, he actually covered the sermon. Everybody was anticipating to be blown away by the so-called Maggid of Vilna, somebody whose great currency so to speak. Why he became chief rabbi was because he was a great darshan. He was a great sermonizer. He absolutely fell flat. He spoke with an accent. He didn't understand the attitude, the rise and falls, the expectations of the rabbinic sermon. And he put it together with sort of the professional obligation to know as much as I can about my field, American Jewish history. And personally, it created a curious small research project.
Yeah.
And I have a particularly strong pain point to read rabbinic sermons and sermon manuals. So I guess that's a strength on my part.
Yeah, it was. I think there's a few of us Dresden nerds out there, and clearly we're two of them. So I was excited to read this, and in the beginning, so you quote Jonathan Sarna, and you say how that in the beginning he used to say that in the beginning people used to come to synagogue in order to talk to God, and now they come to talk to their friends. And that is, I'm wondering if that is still the same 10 years later. Do you?
Well,
you think?
What's happened, I think, what's transformed shul, synagogue in general, in our post-pandemic world, is people's tolerance and their interest in attending shul and going to synagogue. And what I point out in that article, as I recall it, is the movement from sermon to Devar Torah, from drasha to I want to share some words of Torah with you. A Devar Torah centers on much more about content than style. It centers on text study, perhaps. A sermon is organized in a certain way, whether it begins with a joke, whether it has wisdom drawn from the newspaper or literature of some kind, but there's an alchemy that goes on, a very intentional chemistry of how to build a sermon. The Devar Torah, again, it's a different genre. It's not one is not neither better than the other, but it looks different in presentation. Right. And Rabbi Lamb, already in that article in the 1980s, had bemoaned the fall of style of the rabbinic sermon. What we've seen is even less time provided for the rabbi to deliver that sermon, that drasha, that vartar, whatever they call it.
Yeah.
And people are looking differently. There's also, I think, an important difference is that in a very real way, particularly in the Orthodox Jewish world in the United States, the people in the pews to learn Torah for between 10 and 25 minutes per week. They didn't have access, didn't have literacy, they didn't have the tools to access Jewish texts. And what's happened since then, this is happily, as more and more attend day school, they study in college, gap year in yeshiva or seminary. This is particularly the Orthodox world, of course. But then again, engaged, particularly Jews in the conservative world too, I think it holds muster, is that they no longer need the sermon as that once a week moment to engage in Torah study. You have online outlets, you have social media. And so what the expectation of, I have to be here, I have to learn, whether implicit, it might be intuitive. They might not be saying so explicitly, but that's a very real thing. And so the outcome, what our intentions are for the sermon, both on either side of the pulpit, have become different than they once were.
Yeah, I tend to take the side that there's a great quote. I love this quote from Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian, and he said that the real issue with a comedian is that they have to justify why they're the only one speaking while an entire room of people sit quietly listening. And if it's just about the Devar Torah, I believe it's like you're saying that people don't really need the rabbi for the Devar Torah anymore. They almost anything that the rabbi is going to say, they can find online in some form or another. So to justify keeping a room full of people quiet, for 10, 15 minutes on a Shabbos morning, while you tell them something that they could read on a blog post, I think is really, I don't know. I mean, it misses the mark. And it in my mind, it really is it shows a lack of a regard for the responsibility of that speaking slot. I think that speaking slot is, like you said, it has evolved beyond just the information. And what I'd like to ask you is, what do you think it is now? If it's not about the information, what is the point of the drasha?
What is the point of it? I think it's that's what's complicated. It's different things for different people. For many, it is still that one moment per week in a very busy life where people have a chance to study Torah. Hence the movement from sermon to Dvar Torah. For others, it's a source of inspiration. For the rabbi, it may be an opportunity to engage with a larger audience. Your comment is very apt. It's the prime time occasion to engage with a congregation. I think many times it's a moment to see how Torah interacts with the real world. How can we make meaning? At the end of the day, all religious experiences, I feel, are about meaning making. How we make meaning in our lives, is what religion is all about, and the sermon, one way or another, is meant to accomplish that in some way.
Right. What was your upbringing like in terms of the sermons that you used to hear from your rabbi in the shul that you grew up in, or shuls? What was your recollection as a youngster?
That's a good question. I was born in where I am now, actually. I was born in Lower Merion, and now my family has returned to Lower Merion, where I am at Gratz College. But I grew up principally in Baltimore County, the Pikesville area. First, even before that, as Shomer Emunah with Rabbi Tzvi Weinreb. And then as a little boy, we moved across town to what was called suburban. Serbian Orthodox, and Rabbi Irvin Price was the rabbi. Really a wonderful, both wonderful people. Still close to Rabbi Weinreb. Rabbi Price was so wonderful. So was I believe British, so he had a particular authority with his accent. I confess that I was a youth minyan kid, and was spirited away to the upstairs minyan where we had Dunkin' Donuts for Kiddush. But when we were there, my father dutifully had me stay in. Rabbi Price was an old school Yeshiva University Reitz ordained rabbi, and so that meant that he was trained by Rabbi Lookstein, probably Rabbi Joseph Lookstein. His successor, of course, was his son, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, in the sermonics, the homiletics department of yeshiva. Which meant that your sermon was built in a certain structure. It was, you first made relevance by opening it up, by problematizing the moment, either with a quote from the New York Times or something else. Then you sought insight from Jewish text, usually the weekly Torah portion, the Parshat HaShavua, and then you brought it together. That was basically how a sermon was structured. Yeah, and I think that goes with all movements looked in some way, whether you were trained in the seminary by Kaplan or someone else. The idea, again, the sermon has making meaning, being wider, was really important to those rabbis.
Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the article, you talk about you lay the blame at the feet of the Orthodox sermon for a decline, a lack of style and substance. And what do you mean by that? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but I'd love to hear what you say.
Yeah, synagogue as theater, synagogue as experience is really important. You want couldn't have been that scathing just because the OU would never have published it if it was so mean-spirited. But
I'll read you what it says. It says, and you wrote it, I guess, unless they edited it. But it does say that in the beginning, you say that both in style and substance, the contemporary Orthodox sermon has lost meaningfulness. How much meaning is open to debate, but its overall decline is apparent. It remains as a Shabbat morning institution, not because it's a halachic necessity, but because it has grown into an expectation. So that.
Oh, wow. So thanks for reminding me. Wow, I had guts.
You're an angry young man.
Like Billy Joel's song says. So I'll still stick to that, which is, and that's, I mean, we know this, and I hope it doesn't offend, is that the rabbinic sermon was drawn from German Protestant culture. It's true that there was always a drasha sermon delivered in the intermediate week between the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then the weekend, the Shabbat preceding Passover, Pesach. But other than that, the sermon was born in the United States in the 1830s by Rabbi, necessarily an ordained rabbi, Isaac Leeser in Philadelphia, and in German, and then eventually in Eastern European enclaves as well. There is no halachic requirement for there to be a sermon. That's apparent. It became an expectation, and a happy one. A happy one, as Jews became much more desirous of engaging with Torah and engaging with text. They appropriately tapped their rabbinic leadership to supply that. But it doesn't mean we have to have it.
Right.
I'm never, in my own, to just put my cards on the table, I'm never in favor of doing something just because that's how we always did it.
Sure.
That's how you become stale. You always need a process of assessment and review. And the sermon should not be an imposition. In certain circles, like people joke that the Hashkama Minyan, it wasn't so, but the Hashkama Minyan, these early services on Shabbat morning, are meant to provide people an escape from the rabbinic sermon. And lo and behold, now it's very often some of these larger synagogues where there are 4, 5, 6 minyanim services that the rabbi will travel. He'll start in the Hashkama Minyan, and then he'll jump around so he makes sure that he's present in every space, every prayer space on that Shabbat morning, much to the chagrin sometimes of the congregants.
Yeah.
The sermon ought not to be that. It should be filled with meaning. And one way to ensure that is by the choreography. I don't mean where the rabbi is placing themselves on the pulpit, but rather what is the organization of the sermon? What are the intentions? What is the style? What is the flair? What is the highs and lows of the intonation? It's a lost art. And I guess I have Rabbi Lamb to rely on in mourning it.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about, it's interesting. You talk about at the beginning of the century. So the sermons, the cantoral performances, they were there seemingly almost for entertainment value, to provide people with a theater experience like you described. And I love this quote. There was someone who said that they felt more like, he said, he compared his role. One preacher said that he compared his role to a clown dancing on a rope. And another rabbi agreed, characterizing his role not simply as an entertainer, but a comedian. So I think that's interesting that they understood that there was an expectation that you would be engaging. That weren't there necessarily to impart information as much as it was really almost the opposite extreme. They were there to
remember, as Timmy Kaplan and Menachem Blondheim have taught us, is that the cantors, the chazanim, were paid sometimes 5 times as much as the rabbi. Back in the early 20th century. So synagogues entertainment as theater was critically important, and the scholar rabbi who fancied himself this authority when really he was the perception of the congregation was part of the symphony, was part of just the theater
Right. He wasn't
of
a conductor. He was
Saturday morning.
part of the orchestra.
It was a different expectation.
I found a bar mitzvah invitation from my uncle from the 1950s
Okay.
at a shul in the Bronx, and I forget the name of the shul, but Richard Tucker was the cantor there, the chazan there. And what happened was that he was so popular, I guess he procured an agent, and he got hired away to into the entertainment world to sing opera. And his agent was able to break the contract with the shul somehow by there was some negotiation, but that's what it turned into, a performance. And you can kind of almost understand that world where like Jackie Mason was a rabbi and transitioned from rabbi to, from there he said more people were coming to hear the jokes than they were.
No, I mean, look at the very first, I believe, the very first film with sound was Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer, which is
Right.
all about the transition from the cantorate to jazz, the jazz singer.
Right, exactly. So then it seems like from the progression of the article, you talk about how starting in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, where Rabbi Lookstein kind of rejuvenated the movement and imparted a lot more sophistication into it. And I guess Rabbi Lamb was born out of that era.
He was a student of Rabbi Joseph Lookstein. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And so, and then
he was his assistant rabbi, actually, I believe, at KJ.
At the Jewish Center?
At KJ. The Looksteins have been the rabbis of KJ.
Okay,
on the east side. Yeah.
Got it. And it seems like at some point then in the 60s, you talk about how it turned, the sermon slot turned into kind of a platform for speaking about Israel, politics, things like that. And that was the expectation that it, Israel and America, America's stance on Israel and that type of dialogue is what took place during the sermon slot. Is that?
Well, when one takes a look at some of these sermon manuals, whether in all of the religious movements, for that matter. But if you take a look at some of the collected sermon manuals, yeah, they speak to the politics of the moment, whether it be to the Jewry to agitate for day school education, summer camps, Sabbath observance, whatever it is. And there's no question that if one were to take a look, if you were to survey what's available of the Jewish press since certainly 1967, the dominant agenda has been Zionism and support for Israel.
Yeah.
And so that will always, particularly in the, leave it at that.
Yeah. What is your, and then I guess where we ended up at the end of the article was that it turned into the Devar Torah, where people became much more educated, and the rabbis. I think there's a quote in here from you that you talk about how it became. Let me see this quote. It says, many of today's rabbis, as a result, offer up sermons that too often feature more Eastern European folklore than Torah. That our pulpit rabbis champion so-called Jewish values or Shabbat observance is admirable, but hardly inspirational.
Yeah. Now I understand. I never understood why I got this. That article won the Rockower Award for excellence in a single commentary by the American Jewish Press, not reporting, but commentary. So apparently I had a lot of commentary.
Yeah, I'd like to hear you kind of unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by Eastern European folklore?
So I will say, and I don't mean to throw anybody under the bus, but
Still going to take a stand.
In rabbinic circles, there are shared bibliographies of which art scroll book to thumb through and which stories are good fodder for a sermon, jokes and the like. I've heard the same joke told any number of times as part of from the pulpit. The idea that rabbis are collecting stories about whether it be Rabbi Yisrael Meir, HaKohen Kagan, the Chavetz Chaim. There are more stories about the Chavetz Chaim than days that he lived. They can't all be true. And it doesn't matter if it's true or not.
Yeah.
But the need to lean on these stories has been interesting. I don't think I'm at where I was 10 years ago in thinking about this. Now, maybe just a little bit older. I give people more pass and let you be you, perhaps. But I don't, when the content shifts from the substance of Torah study to the story, when the Rabbinic Sermon, and I've heard it, has been 99% story and not study or meaning making, although you can make meaning of stories. You can write books about stories. I think something misses the point.
Yeah. So what made me send you a message and say I'd love to talk to you is this last line where you wrote, long ago, nonetheless, it's difficult to deny the parallels between the American Orthodox sermons delivered today and a century ago. Long ago, those men begrudgingly accepted their roles as entertainers and comedians. Our generation desires something more. We require leaders. And that was such a powerful ending to your to your article that I wanted to talk about that for a moment, because when I guess the sermon, even as Devar Torah, even if we were able to move beyond the fluff and the stories and the padding of kind of light content, light on substance, and we're able to impart information, it still, in my mind at least, it doesn't connote leadership. It doesn't indicate leadership. And what I'd love to hear from you is what do you mean by that? What do you mean that the generation desires something more? We require leaders. How does the sermon facilitate?
Well, so I think I understand. So if the sermon is meant to fulfill the obligation of delivering a sermon, and the content, the substance of it, is a rabbinic adage or tale, it doesn't connect to the moment, it doesn't connect to the vicissitudes of Torah study, that's a problem. And in that moment, I suppose, and I still feel, I think that we need rabbinic leadership. We don't need somebody to fill 15 minutes at 10:30 in the morning on a Saturday. It's an opportunity to it is still the case that, as you point out, that the sermon is a primetime event, but not usually delivered in prime time, but it is a primetime event.
Yeah.
And
prime time really just means you have an audience. You have that
right. And because you have an audience, don't lose the moment. Don't just fulfill your obligation. Use it. Yeah, so I guess I still feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that really resonated with me, because that's something that's it makes sense. It just really makes sense. You don't need, no one needs you to speak. We don't need that. We don't need you for your information. Right. But I think that a lot of people are a lot of so-called leaders, at least in maybe their younger years, are reluctant to do that, to stand behind and assert themselves and stand behind their message. And they do what I like to call is hide and speak. They'll give a very sophisticated Devar Torah, build this towering infrastructure of Torah, and then distribute all the weight of the sermon onto that. And at the very, very last moment, at the end of the Devar Torah, they'll kind of take a step back and say, in closing, we should all strive to be like Moshe Rabbeinu or something like that. Good Shabbos. And you really, you didn't assert yourself. You put the Torah out there and you hid behind it. And but what I advocate for, at least in my method of sermon methodology, is a message first type of sermon, where the rabbi / leader should have a message in mind that he wants his congregation to hear, whatever that message might be, whatever spiritual growth he has in mind for the community, whatever he wants to tell them, and he builds the Torah around that. So, and that takes you have to be willing to assert yourself and put yourself out there on the line, and there are people that might not agree with it and might call you to task on it and argue with you on it, but the message is really the sermon, and the Torah bolsters the message, but it's not, you're not hiding behind the Torah.
Sounds on point. Yeah.
What's your ideal sermon? What, if you had a choice, what would you love to hear? What would be a perfect sermon for you to sit in, and have you heard them recently?
I heard them. Yeah. It's cliche and it's something you can anticipate. I remember in Chicago, feels a long time ago, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs came to visit, and he delivered a sermon without any notes. He did this thing where he placed his elbow on the lectern, the stender, and opened up his arms, and he said, "My friends," and he invited us all into his thinking. Now, I tried that as a scholar in residence a few months later. It did not work as well. But there was something really majestic and charismatic. He felt like he was talking directly to you. There was Torah, there was an urgent message, there was inspiration. You felt better, and you felt tasked with something afterward. Other people, I don't want to start naming other names so that I'll leave some other colleagues out. But that's the type of thing. I want to feel like that person's talking to me, telling me that I've got to be better. We all have to be better, right? Every day we try to be better. We try to improve what we're doing professionally, the organizations, the businesses, the families that we're a part of. We all stand to get better. So sermon should be an intervention to move us in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And when your brief stint as rabbinic intern, what was your style?
What was my style? To hang on for dear life. I remember. I remember when I finally got a chance to deliver the sermon at the Jewish Center. I had my sermon stapled. It's stapled together, so I had to flip through it, and oh my goodness. That's not what you do. Everybody knows you just slide the papers to the side as you finish them, so it's elegant, so nobody sees the material that you're using. Oh boy, was that an experience. Oh wow. What is my style? No, I still just last week I was in Baltimore, lived as a scholar in residence. Personally, what works for me is to have a couple of sentences I want to have absolutely discreetly clear. Otherwise, an outline. I feel that personally, I succeed much better in an extemporary format with guiding bullets to move me along, with text to guide me to make sure that I'm on course. Other people read very nicely. And people that I went to yeshiva with, they spend hours refining and almost memorizing a drasha sermon before they ascend the pulpit on a Shabbat morning. That's incredible. That could be a great use of one's time. Everybody's got a different set.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on? I know there's a lot of debate about Shabbos Shuvah drashas. Some people love the pill pull and the nuances in the Rambam and Hilchos Tshuva, and then other people, go for the jugular in terms of fire and brimstone, or even trying to lift people up, but less on the content as much as much less on the information, as more on the transformation. What are your thoughts?
Interesting. Well, I think generally, because I have friends who ask me for guidance sometimes, just to read materials or content and the like. I think that there is much more of an attempt to find texts that inspire. You asked me about Shabbos Shuvah, but for example, I'm thinking about Shabbos Hagadol right before Passover or Pesach.
Yeah.
Less about the technical nuances about how to observe Pesach, but more about the uplift. A lot more on Seder night and Maggid and the obligation to pass on traditions to multiple generations. Much more than baking matzah or what is and is not chametz, leavened bread. And I think the same thing holds true with Shabbos Shuvah. Less fire and brimstone, less halachic, although it's not really a halachic sermon historically. Much more about how do we improve, how do we make it. Maybe the Shabbos Shuvah is the last vestige of the Rabbinic Sermon, particularly in Orthodox circles.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. All right, just one or two last questions. In terms of rabbis who share personal details about themselves in order to connect with their congregation, to lift them up, how do you feel about that? I mean, there's also different schools of thought. There's the formal rabbi that kind of buttoned up, and maybe he's a more of a figure of leadership and flawlessness. And then there's the leader from the trenches who's, there struggling just to, with you beside you and saying, follow me, this is what's worked for me. And this is let's work on this together.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I do not personally care for. I do not like it when the rabbi makes the sermon, provides the full window as if the congregation is living their Judaism vicariously through the rabbi.
Can you give me an example?
Right there?
Yeah, give me an example.
Give me an example. When the rabbi says, I was at a delegation last week, and this is what I want to report back to you.
Oh.
I think that's probably a little too egocentric.
Right, I've seen that. Here's a glimpse into the window of my rabbinic world.
Of my day.
Yeah.
But don't get me wrong, right? Some of the greatest Broadway shows are like The Producers. Some of the greatest television shows are about television, 30 Rock.
Self-referential.
So we all write about what we know. So there always is going to be an element of that. But we have to be careful that the congregation's Judaism doesn't become the rabbi's weekday. That, I think, is always, and again, it's a professional hazard in any industry. The rabbin is no exception.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the personal parts of their lives, in terms of things that, I'll give you an example. I was listening to there's a great podcast. I'll forward it to you about. It was by the Hartstein Institute about the art of the sermon, and it was right before the high holidays, and they interviewed David Wolpe, who is the conservative rabbi in Temple Sinai. Yeah. And so he talks about, I mean, I've never actually heard any of his sermons, but Yoshua Kurtzer, who was Kurtzer, I think, Kurtzer was interviewing him and said that, you've talked to your congregation about your divorce, about your illness, different things through the years. There was 25 years in the pulpit, and they grow to know each other as a result. Which is, how any relationship is formed by revealing parts of yourself and trusting that the other party will reciprocate and not exploit it. And but I'm curious about your thoughts about that in terms of turning that speaking platform into kind of a glimpse into the personal Judaism, the personal, not necessarily the professional, but the personal aspect of the Jew, of the leader, Jewish leader.
Oh. I think making oneself vulnerable and personal and humanizing our experiences are wonderful, are very courageous. It shows. I think it shows a level of humility and makes it personal. So it comes at risk. Don't want to overshare, But yeah, certainly.
Right. Right. And there are other schools of thought that would say that, you can't show any flaws, that you're the leader, and that you need to, show the ideal, even if your life might not necessarily be the ideal, but to project an aura of the ideal.
Yeah, I think there's still that one has to protect the office, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very real thing. So there's a tension there that one needs to negotiate in the pulpit.
Great. All right. And the last question I want to ask you is in terms of 21st century attention spans, how you believe those should be managed? Because, I'll tell you, I have a 17, 18-year-old kid who'll sit on TikTok and he'll scroll 6-second video after 6-second video for hours and hours and hours and hours. And his attention span is shot. And this is the new generation. This is the generation, in 5-10 years, he'll be in the audience, listening to the Rabbi Sermon in a shul. And how do you compete? How do you keep people awake? How do you keep people engaged? How do you keep people invested without being that clown dancing on the rope that you described earlier? What are your thoughts about that? Because
Well, I think that in liberal circles, places like Park Avenue and Central Synagogue have embraced and become essentially invested in film companies to reach a broader audience on a sort of a shul without borders concept.
Multimedia.
So certainly that's the case. It's tough. It's tough. Some rabbis will bring in props to hold people's attention. I don't mean props like tongue in cheek. I mean quite literally that if they'll bring in the book that they're quoting so they can pick it up. They'll have other things just to carry some attention. I think it's a very real thing. It has the same issue in the classroom, same issue in camp settings.
Right. Well, the thing with classrooms and campsites, I guess it's a bit informal there. You can engage in conversation and you can have
correct
participation. This is a monologue for the most part.
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. Absolutely.
So what would, at what expense, there's obviously Torah to impart. There's obviously attention to be sustained. That balance, I think, is the new challenge of this century. And I just, to me, it's there's not going to be a lot of people that are natural born engagers. With this attention span really just requires some new skills that I think people personally, they're not natural skills. I think they need to be learned. Unless you're an entertainer, I guess. But I'm curious how people will manage to pull that off without swinging to one end of the spectrum where they just become, joke after joke after joke after joke after joke, and just a little bit of Torah, versus the other end of the spectrum where you have all the Torah and just, it's very dry, and then just sprinkle a little bit, of seasoning in order to make it palatable. There's going to emerge some new type of speakers, and I'm curious do you know any of? We don't have Rabbi Sachs with us anymore, and we don't have Rabbi Lamb, and we don't have. But who have you recognized any of these new types of speakers?
I want to meet them.
That'll be Anyways, I've taken up a lot of your time, and you've been amazing.
I think this is fantastic.
Yeah, this has been so enjoyable. Indulgent, I could say.
You've been listening to The Maggid Method, and I'm Daniel Steinberg. Learn more about The Maggid Method at maggidmethod.com, maggidmethod.com. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.